The biting wind howled its ancient song across the desolate peaks, carrying with it the scent of pine and an inescapable chill that seeped into the very marrow of bone. Ilara knew this song intimately, a constant companion to her solitude, a mournful symphony that had echoed through her life since childhood. Her hands, calloused and chapped from endless labor, clutched the rough woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, offering meager defense against the relentless cold. The ice, a formidable, indifferent entity, held the landscape in its unforgiving grip, preserving secrets beneath its crystalline surface for centuries, perhaps millennia. It was a world of stark beauty and brutal indifference, a mirror to the life Ilara had carved out for herself, far from the whispers and judging eyes of the distant settlement. She moved with an innate grace born of necessity, her gaze sweeping the frozen expanse, searching for the herbs and resilient roots that sustained her meager existence. Each step was deliberate, a silent pact with the earth, a testament to her enduring will. Then the world shifted, not with a tremor in the ground but with a chilling stillness, a disruption in the familiar rhythm of the wind. A glint of something unnatural, something not rock or ice or stunted tree, caught her eye. It was beneath the surface of a small, partially thawed glacial pool, a dark shape suspended within the opaque depths. Curiosity, a dangerous and often lonely companion, tugged at her, pulling her closer, each breath a cloud against the frigid air. As she knelt, carefully chipping away at the fragile edges of the thawing ice with a broken shard of flint, the form began to resolve itself. It was the figure of a man, encased within the translucent prison, his features surprisingly preserved, his braids woven with feathers, his face a silent mask of stoic serenity. A warrior, by the markings on his leathers, a Shoshone from a time long past, perhaps even mythical. The thought, cold and sharp as the ice itself, pierced through her. He was not merely frozen. He was suspended in time, a ghost from an era of forgotten battles and ancient spirits. A tremor, not of cold but of an inexplicable emotional resonance, ran through her. This was not a discovery. It was an encounter with destiny, a silent plea from the past reaching out across the chasm of ages. The village, with its narrow minds and narrower hearts, would see only an ill omen, a trespass against the natural order, a reason to further ostracize her. But Ilara saw something else. She saw a quiet dignity, a profound vulnerability, and perhaps a reflection of her own enduring isolation. The decision, when it came, was not born of logic or prudence, but of an impulse as primal and unyielding as the mountains themselves. She would save him. She would draw him from his icy tomb, consequences be damned. The arduous task of freeing him began, a silent, desperate struggle against time and the unyielding grip of winter. Each swing of her makeshift tools, each grunt of effort, was a defiance hurled at the indifferent sky. The sun, a pale, anemic orb, began its descent, casting long, skeletal shadows across the frozen world, a silent witness to her solitary, impossible task. The air grew heavier, colder, promising an even deeper freeze as night descended. But Ilara did not falter. Her heart, normally a muted drumbeat in her chest, now pounded with a strange, fierce urgency, echoing the distant, ancient drum of a future she could not yet comprehend. This was not just a rescue. It was a pact, an unspoken vow that would irrevocably alter the course of her solitary life, binding her to a history she could only begin to imagine. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The sun had long since surrendered to the merciless grip of night by the time Ilara finally managed to dislodge the warrior from his crystalline coffin. Her muscles screamed in protest, each fiber stretched to its breaking point, her fingers numb and clumsy. The body, heavy and unyielding, was a dead weight, yet she dragged him inch by agonizing inch across the treacherous ice and snow, the effort a testament to a stubbornness born of long isolation. Her small, dilapidated cabin, little more than a collection of rough-hewn logs and mud, offered scant refuge from the elements, but it was home, and it was warm enough. A small, carefully tended fire crackled in the hearth, its hungry flames dancing, casting flickering shadows that made the warrior's still face seem to twitch with unnatural life. She laid him gently on her meager bed of furs, his skin, impossibly pale, radiating a profound, unnatural cold that seeped into her own weary bones. His clothes, stiff with ice, clung to him like a second skin, ancient and unfamiliar. The arduous process of thawing him began, a delicate balance between urgency and caution. She wrapped him in every spare blanket she possessed, piling furs atop him, then placed heated stones, carefully warmed in the fire, around his rigid limbs. The air in the small cabin grew thick with the scent of damp wool and melting ice, mingled with the faint, musky odor of ancient deerskin. Time stretched and blurred, marked only by the shifting patterns of firelight on the walls and the agonizing slowness of his thaw. She watched him, endlessly, her gaze tracing the sharp planes of his cheekbones, the elegant curve of his jaw, the intricate braiding of his hair. Who was he? What battle had he fought? What journey had he undertaken to meet such a strange, suspended fate? Questions, sharp and unanswerable, pricked at her mind, yet she pushed them aside. Her focus narrowed to the immediate, desperate task, to breathe life back into a man who had been dead, or at least beyond the realm of living, for an immeasurable span of time. Doubt, cold and insidious, began to creep in around the edges of her resolve. What had she done? What strange, possibly cursed thing had she brought into her solitary world? The village elders spoke of spirits, of ill omens, of the dangerous consequences of disturbing ancient slumber. Their words, usually dismissed as the fearful prattle of small minds, now held a chilling resonance in the quiet of her cabin. She was an outsider, always had been, her independent nature and quiet defiance making her a target for their suspicion. This act, this impossible, reckless act, would solidify their fears, prove their worst accusations true. Yet, even as the fear tightened its grip, a stubborn refusal to abandon him welled up within her. He was here now, a profound weight, a living, breathing mystery, and she, Alara, was inexplicably bound to him. It was a burden, heavy and fraught with unknown perils, but also a strange, compelling purpose in a life that had often felt devoid of meaning beyond mere survival. She changed his clothes, replacing the ancient frozen leather with softer, warmer wool. His body, though still cold, was no longer rigid, a subtle yielding that whispered of a returning life. His breath, when it finally came, was a shallow, almost imperceptible whisper against the still air, a phantom sound that Alara strained to hear, fearing it might cease at any moment. Her own exhaustion was profound, a bone-deep weariness that threatened to drag her into the dark abyss of sleep, but she fought it, her vigilance unwavering. The stakes felt impossibly high, though she couldn't articulate why. This was more than just saving a life. It felt like holding a fragment of the past, a piece of something vast and forgotten in her trembling hands. The first light of dawn, pale and hesitant, filtered through the cabin's small window, painting the warrior's still face in shades of silver and gray. He remained unmoving, a statue of flesh and bone, yet the subtle warmth now emanating from him, a faint, almost imperceptible warmth, was a testament to the fragile victory of her will. She had pulled him from the ice. Now, the real struggle, the unknown journey truly began. Days blurred into a monotonous rhythm of watchful waiting, of tending the fire, of coaxing small amounts of broth between his unresponsive lips. Alara rarely slept, her mind a ceaseless current of worry and anticipation. Then, on the third day, a subtle tremor rippled through the warrior's eyelids, a fleeting flicker that made Alara's heart lurch. Later, a faint sigh escaped his lips, a sound so soft it might have been the wind. And then, he stirred. A slow, agonizing shift of his shoulders, a slight clenching of his hands. His eyes, when they finally opened, were a profound, unsettling blue, clouded with disorientation and a deep, ancient pain. They scanned the small cabin uncomprehending before settling on Alara's face, holding her gaze with an intensity that made her breath catch. There was no recognition, only a raw, primal confusion. Yet in their depths she sensed a flicker of something vast and unknowable, like staring into the depths of a frozen lake. He tried to speak, his throat working, but only a raspy guttural sound escaped, a broken whisper that conveyed nothing. His first movements were clumsy, uncoordinated, like a fawn struggling to find its legs. Alara helped him sit up, propping him with furs, offering water from a carved wooden cup. He drank deeply, his eyes still fixed on her, a silent question in their depths. Communication was an impossible chasm between them. She spoke her simple tongue, gentle words of reassurance, of the mountain, of the snow, of the fire. He listened, his head tilted, a strange light entering his eyes as if searching for meaning in the foreign sounds. He tried again to speak, pointing vaguely towards the window, then to his chest, a look of profound frustration clouding his features. A memory, she surmised, a dream, a vision was trying to break through the fog of his long slumber. He was a man out of time, stripped of his context, his language, his very sense of self. A profound empathy, sharp and unexpected, pierced Ilara. She knew that feeling, the isolation of being misunderstood, of having a truth within you that others could not or would not grasp. Meanwhile, rumors, carried on the cruel wings of the wind, had begun to reach the distant village. A trapper, venturing unusually close to Ilara's secluded dwelling, had seen smoke rising from her chimney at odd hours, had glimpsed a male figure through a break in the snow-laden trees. Whispers, insidious and swift, spread like wildfire through the communal fires. "Ilara, the strange one," they muttered, "has taken a man into her dwelling." The simple fact quickly morphed into monstrous fables. Some claimed it was a demon, conjured from the icy depths, a creature of ill omen. Others more maliciously suggested it was a rogue warrior, a savage from the enemy tribes, whom Ilara, in her defiance of village norms, had harbored. Her isolation, once a protective shield, now became a magnifying glass for their suspicions. She had always been different, preferring the company of the mountains to the gossip of women, the silence of the forest to the boisterousness of men. She healed with herbs, spoke to the wind, and carried a quiet sorrow that no one understood. This new transgression, the presence of an unknown man, was the final straw. The village elders, their faces grim and etched with the harsh lines of prejudice, called a council. Their fear was palpable, a suffocating presence in the communal lodge. "This woman, Ilara," the lead elder, a man named Taryn, intoned, his voice deep and gravelly, "has always walked a solitary, dangerous path. Now, she harbors a stranger, a man of unknown origin, potentially a threat to our very existence." The consensus was swift and brutal. She had defied their unwritten laws, brought an unknown danger into their fragile world. They spoke of the sanctity of their traditions, of the purity of their bloodlines, of the dangers of outsiders. They spoke of curses, of vengeful spirits, of the need to protect their community from the unknown. Ilara, miles away, tending to the silent, awakening warrior, felt a shiver unrelated to the cold pass through her. She knew instinctively that the world she had carefully constructed, the delicate balance of her solitary existence, was about to be shattered by the narrow-mindedness of those who feared anything beyond their understanding. The tension, like a taut bowstring, stretched across the frozen landscape, the calm before an inevitable storm. The warrior, Kyle, as Ilara had tentatively named him for the sound he sometimes made, a low, resonant hum, grew stronger with each passing day, though his words remained a frustrating, agonizing absence. He would sit by the fire, his piercing blue eyes fixed on the flickering flames, a deep furrow etched between his brows. Often, he would reach out, his long fingers sketching patterns in the dirt of the cabin floor, lines and curves that seemed to hold a desperate significance only to him. He was trying to communicate desperately, but the chasm of language and memory was vast. Yet a new, more unsettling development began to manifest. He would jolt awake in the dead of night, bathed in a cold sweat, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at something only he could perceive. He would murmur, a guttural stream of sounds, phrases perhaps from his forgotten tongue, laced with a palpable terror. It was a recurring nightmare, a vivid, disturbing vision that gripped him in its icy embrace, leaving him shaken and bereft. Ilara would sit with him, a comforting presence, offering him warm water, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a silent anchor in his waking nightmare. She saw the same fear in his eyes that she had often glimpsed in her own reflection, after particularly vivid, disturbing dreams of her past. They were both haunted by unseen specters. He tried, in his waking hours, to convey the essence of these nightmares. He would point to his head, then to the vast, empty space beyond the cabin walls, his gestures sweeping, expansive, hinting at something monumental. He would draw crude figures in the dirt, figures that seemed to writhe and contort, and then point to himself, a look of profound anguish on his face. It was a prophecy, Ilara began to suspect, or a premonition, something terrifying and unavoidable that had perhaps led him to his frozen fate. There was a shared burden in their silence, an unspoken understanding that transcended words. Ilara, too, carried her own silent traumas, her own private visions of a world that refused to understand her. She saw in Cale's eyes a kindred spirit, an outsider adrift in a world that sought to define, to constrain, to fear what it could not comprehend. This shared sense of otherness, this mutual vulnerability, slowly began to forge a fragile, unspoken bond between them, a tendril of connection in the vast wilderness of their isolation. Meanwhile, the whispers from the village had begun to solidify into a concrete plan. Taran, the lead elder, fueled by fear and a rigid adherence to tradition, had sent scouts to confirm the rumors. They had returned, faces grim, their reports confirming the presence of a man in Ilara's cabin. He is large, one reported, eyes wide with imagined terror, and silent. He watches with eyes like winter ice. Their descriptions, embellished by fear, painted a terrifying picture, transforming Cale into a monstrous entity, a harbinger of doom. The elders decided they would send a delegation not to question but to demand. They would confront Ilara, force her to reveal the truth, and if necessary, remove the threat from their midst. Their fear, tightly woven with superstition and a deep-seated prejudice against anything unfamiliar, had festered into a dangerous resolve. They believed their very survival depended on eradicating the anomaly Ilara had introduced. Ilara sensed their approach before she saw them. The air grew heavy, thick with unseen presences. A tremor of apprehension, cold and sharp, snaked through her. Kyle, too, seemed to sense it. He rose from his furs, his posture suddenly rigid, his head cocked, listening. His eyes, now less clouded, held a sharp, primal alertness. He was a warrior again, even if his memory remained a fractured mosaic. The approaching footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crunched on the frozen ground. Soon the figures emerged from the tree line, a grim procession of elders and younger, more aggressive men, their faces set in hard, unyielding lines. Taran, their leader, stepped forward, his eyes, dark and accusing, fixed on Ilara. His voice, when he spoke, was low and guttural, resonating with collective judgment. "Ilara," he began, "you have defied the ancient laws. You have brought a stranger, a man of unknown origins, into our lands. We demand to know his purpose. We demand to know his name." The words hung heavy in the frigid air, imbued with the weight of generations of prejudice, of fear of the unknown. Ilara stepped forward, her own voice, though soft, carrying an unexpected steel. "He is a man," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "Rescued from the ice. He has no name, no memory of his past. He poses no threat." Her words, simple and direct, seemed to enrage them further. "No name?" Terrence scoffed, his face contorting with disdain. "A demon, then, a spirit of the frozen wastes. You defy us, Ilara, as you always have. You invite disaster upon our people." As Terrence spoke, Kyle, who had been standing silently behind Ilara, let out a low, guttural growl, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. His eyes, the startling blue of glacier ice, fixed on Terran. His right hand, which had been resting by his side, slowly lifted, his fingers pointing directly at the elder, then tracing a chaotic pattern in the air, a series of frantic, desperate gestures. He then clutched his head, groaning, his knees buckling slightly, as if struck by an invisible blow. It was a seizure of memory, a burst of vision so powerful it overwhelmed him. An older woman, quiet and observant, one of the few who still occasionally sought Ilara's herbal remedies, stepped forward from the delegation. Her name was Mara, and she possessed a wisdom that transcended the elders' rigid rules. Her eyes, clouded with age, focused not on Kyle's frantic gestures, but on the profound distress etched on his face, and then on Ilara's unwavering protectiveness. Silence. Mara's voice, though frail, cut through the rising clamor. She moved closer to Kyle, ignoring the nervous murmurs of the men. She looked deep into his eyes, and then her own eyes widened, a gasp escaping her lips. "He is not a demon," she whispered, her voice trembling, "but a vessel. He carries a vision, a prophecy." She turned to Taryn, her gaze sharp, piercing through his hardened resolve. "His mind is burdened with images of a great darkness, a shattering. And she," Mara pointed to Alara, "she is intertwined with it. Her face, it is woven into his waking dreams. She is not a threat, Taryn, but a part of what is to come, a part of the warning." The words hung in the air, chilling and profound, turning the village's fear into a new, more unsettling dread. The mystery had deepened, not lessened, binding Alara and Kale together in a destiny they were only just beginning to grasp. Mara's words, a fragile bridge between the rational and the mystical, had momentarily stunned the village delegation into silence. They looked from Mara to Alara, then to Kyle, their fear now tinged with a dawning, unwilling awe. Taryn, ever the pragmatist, scoffed, "Nonsense, Mara, old woman's ramblings. He is a savage, a threat." But even his voice lacked its usual conviction. The seed of doubt planted by Mara's unexpected revelation had begun to sprout in their rigid minds. Kyle, after his sudden seizure of memory, had collapsed onto the furs, his body trembling, his breathing shallow. Alara knelt beside him, her hand on his forehead, which was clammy with cold sweat. She could feel the tremors that still racked his frame, the profound exhaustion that followed such a violent outpouring of his fractured consciousness. As Kyle slowly regained a semblance of calm, a new kind of communication began to emerge between them, one born not of words, but of shared trauma and unspoken understanding. He would point hesitantly to his chest, then to the scar that ran across his ribs, a jagged line that spoke of an ancient wound. Then, with an intensity that burned in his blue eyes, he would begin to draw in the dirt once more, not chaotic patterns, but clearer, more deliberate images. He drew a vast, snowy plain, then crude stick figures engaged in a fierce battle, their spears and bows depicted with surprising detail. Then a single dominant figure betraying another, a dagger plunged into a back, and finally, the image of a great chasm opening in the earth, swallowing everything. It was a story, fragmented and wordless, but undeniably a story of betrayal, of catastrophe, of a world consumed by violence. Alara, watching, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the outside air. She understood, with a terrible certainty, that this was not merely a memory, but the terrifying source of his long slumber, the event that had encased him in ice. A flash of memory, unbidden, surfaced in Alara's own mind, a muted, painful echo of her own past. Not a battle, but a different kind of betrayal, a different chasm opening. She remembered the dismissive looks, the whispers that followed her after her parents' sudden death, leaving her an orphan and an outcast in a community that valued family above all else. She remembered the men who had tried to take advantage of her vulnerability, the harsh rejection when she had fought back. She had retreated to the mountains, seeking refuge from a world that had offered her nothing but cruelty. Kale, too, had been betrayed, not by societal judgment, but by the sharp edge of a blade and the unforgiving maw of the earth. Their scars, though different, were woven from the same thread of profound loss and abandonment. They were both survivors, flung by fate into the harsh crucible of isolation. This quiet revelation, this unspoken recognition of shared pain, deepened the fragile bond between them. He was not just a warrior from another time. He was a mirror, reflecting her own enduring strength, her own quiet despair. He looked at her then, his blue eyes holding a newfound clarity, a glimmer of something akin to trust. He reached out, his hand hovering, then gently touched her face, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheekbone. It was a gesture of profound vulnerability, an acknowledgement of their connection. Alara did not flinch. She met his gaze, a silent understanding passing between them, a recognition that they were two broken pieces, perhaps, but pieces that fit, somehow, together. The village, with its encroaching fear, now seemed a distant, almost irrelevant entity. In the quiet solitude of her cabin, a new world was slowly, painstakingly being forged, a world built on unspoken truths, on shared burdens, and on the terrifying, compelling mystery that bound them to a future neither could yet comprehend. The air crackled with a subtle tension, not of fear, but of an escalating destiny. The village, reeling from Mara's cryptic pronouncements and their own simmering fear, did not retreat entirely. Instead, their fear mutated, becoming more insidious, more dangerous. Taran, his authority challenged, his pride wounded, found new ways to stoke the flames of panic. "The old woman's words are but a smokescreen," he bellowed in the communal lodge, his voice echoing with righteous indignation. "This man is a foreign spirit, an invader. He will bring pestilence, famine, war. We must cleanse our land of this evil." His words, amplified by the anxieties of a harsh winter and dwindling resources, resonated deeply with the villagers. They saw Kyle not as a victim of fate, but as a curse, a living embodiment of their deepest fears about the unknown, about anything that disrupted their tightly controlled world. The small path leading to Alara's cabin, once rarely trod, now bore the marks of frequent patrols. Young men, armed with crude spears and bows, would stand at the edge of the tree line, watching, their faces grim and suspicious. Sometimes, they would shout insults, words of warning, or even threats, their voices carrying on the wind, sharp as shards of ice. "Send the demon back to the ice," they would cry. "He does not belong here. You do not belong here, Alara." The hostility was palpable, a suffocating presence that pressed in on Alara's small sanctuary. She felt like an animal caught in a snare, the walls closing in, the danger growing with each passing day. The peace she had found in her isolation was shattered, replaced by a constant state of vigilance, a gnawing dread. She knew their fear, understood the brutal logic of their narrow world. They would protect their own, no matter the cost, even if that meant destroying her and the man she had rescued. Kale, despite his continued muteness, sensed the escalating threat. His primal instincts, sharpened by a life of warfare and survival, were on high alert. He would stand at the small window, his gaze fixed on the distant figures, his muscles tensed, a low growl sometimes rumbling in his chest. He was like a cornered wolf, ready to fight, but without a clear understanding of the enemy or the landscape. Alara found herself caught between two worlds, the immediate, terrifying reality of Kale's presence and the external, equally terrifying threat of the village's encroaching hostility. She knew they would not wait indefinitely. Their fear would soon boil over into action. The question was not if they would come, but when, and with what force. She began to prepare, gathering what meager supplies she had, sharpening her old hunting knife, securing the cabin door with extra logs. It was a desperate, futile effort against overwhelming numbers, but it was all she had. The irony of the situation was a bitter taste in her mouth. She, who had always sought solitude, was now at the center of a conflict she had not sought, protecting a man who could not even speak his own name. Her act of compassion had become a catalyst for communal fear, twisting her into the villain in their narrow narrative. She was no longer just the strange, independent woman. She was the witch, the harbinger of ill fortune, the one who harbored the demon. The emotional intensity in the cabin was thick, a palpable tension. Kyle would look at her, his eyes filled with a desperate urgency, as if trying to convey a crucial warning, a hidden truth about his vision that remained locked behind the impenetrable wall of his forgotten language. Alara strained to understand, her heart aching with the effort, sensing that the key to their survival lay not just in physical defense, but in unraveling the secrets held within his fragmented memories. The rhythmic tension building had reached a fever pitch. The storm was no longer on the horizon, but gathering directly overhead. The air crackled with the static charge of impending conflict, and Alara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the climax was upon them. It was on the 5th day after his awakening, a day cloaked in a bone-chilling fog that clung to the trees like a shroud, that Kale's vision finally broke free, raw and unfiltered. He had been sitting by the fire, unusually agitated, his hands clenching and unclenching. Suddenly he rose, his movements swift and purposeful, and grasped Alara's shoulders, his blue eyes, no longer clouded by disorientation, burning with an intense, desperate clarity. He began to speak not in the broken guttural sounds of the past few days, but in a rush of fluid, resonant words from his own ancient tongue. It was a torrent of sound that Ilara could not understand, yet the meaning, the sheer weight of it crashed over her like a tidal wave. His voice was laced with urgency, with profound sorrow, with a terrifying premonition. His words, though foreign, carried the undeniable cadence of a desperate warning, a plea. As he spoke, his eyes never leaving hers, the cabin seemed to fade, replaced by vivid, terrifying images that manifested in her mind, a shared hallucination of the future. She saw a land consumed by an unimaginable cold, a winter that would not end, stretching across years, turning rivers to stone and forests to skeletal remains. She saw the sky, once blue, bleeding with an unnatural light, the sun a pale, dying ember. She saw people, her people shivering, starving, their faces gaunt with despair, their lives slowly extinguished by the relentless grip of eternal ice. And then she saw it, a great fracturing of the earth, not a localized chasm but a vast apocalyptic rift, tearing the very world apart, swallowing mountains, cities, and entire civilizations in its gaping maw. It was the same catastrophe he had drawn in the dirt, but now it was imbued with sound, with screams, with the deafening roar of a dying world. This was his burden, the memory of his past, the terrifying vision of a future he had been frozen to prevent, or perhaps to warn about. And then, in the midst of this cataclysmic vision, her face appeared, not just in his eyes but within the vision itself, a beacon, a small flicker of warmth against the overwhelming cold. She was standing amidst the desolation, her hands outstretched, a single verdant sprout emerging from the cracked earth beneath her feet. It was not a vision of her saving the world, but a vision of her enduring, of her representing a chance, a fragile hope in the face of utter annihilation. Her face was not merely seen, it was intertwined with the prophecy, a fundamental element of the unfolding destiny. It was a future where her very presence, her innate connection to the resilient life of the mountains, held a profound, symbolic significance. The words of Mara echoed, "Her face it is woven into his waking dreams. She is not a threat, Terran, but a part of what is to come, a part of the warning." When Kale's words finally ceased and the terrifying images receded, Ilara stood trembling, her mind reeling. The air in the cabin seemed charged, electric with the weight of what had just transpired. He had not just woken to a new world, he had woken with the knowledge of a dying one, a knowledge that now, in a terrifying, undeniable flash, was hers too. The prophecy of the Shoshone warrior from the ice was not merely a warning, it was a testament to their intertwined fates. His vision had indeed seen her face not as a fleeting image, but as a pivotal part of a future so bleak, so vast, that it made the petty squabbles of the village seem trivial, inconsequential. The mystery was fully revealed, the emotional climax reached. They were not just survivors. They were bound by a shared, terrifying knowledge, entrusted with a silent, impossible burden. Their world, once small and isolated, had suddenly expanded to encompass the fate of all creation, and their fight, once against mere men, was now against the very forces of nature itself. The air outside Ilara's cabin thickened, not with fog, but with the palpable tension of impending conflict. The silence was broken only by the crunch of heavy footsteps approaching, a rhythmic, ominous beat against the frozen ground. The villagers had come. Their angry shouts, once distant, now rang clear, piercing the pre-dawn stillness. "Bring out the demon! Burn the witch!" The words were like stones thrown against the thin walls of her cabin. Ilara's heart pounded, a frantic drum against her ribs. She looked at Kale, his face grim, his eyes reflecting a fierce resolve. The vision, still raw in her mind, made the village's petty fears seem absurd, yet their threat was immediate, deadly. This was the moment of reckoning, the pivotal emotional climax they had been hurtling towards. "They mean to kill you," Ilara whispered, her voice tight with a fear she rarely allowed herself to show. "And me, for harboring you." Kale nodded, his jaw set. He picked up a stout length of wood from beside the hearth, testing its weight in his hand, his movements suddenly fluid, predatory. The warrior, so recently broken and disoriented, was now fully awakened, his instincts honed by forgotten battles. There was no need for words between them now. The shared vision, the terrifying glimpse of a world dissolving, had forged an unbreakable bond, a singular purpose. Their survival was no longer just about themselves. It was about the fragile flicker of hope represented in Cale's prophecy, the promise of a green sprout in a desolate future. They could not, would not, allow themselves to be extinguished by the narrow-mindedness of men. The cabin door, old and flimsy, splintered inward with a loud crack as the villagers, emboldened by their numbers and their fear, burst in. Taran stood at the front, his face contorted with rage and a chilling certainty of his righteous cause. Behind him surged a tide of grim-faced men, armed with crude axes, sharpened stakes, and the cold glint of hatred in their eyes. The small space was instantly filled with their aggressive presence, their shouts, their heavy breathing. "There he is," one man roared, pointing at Kyle. "The demon!" Kyle met their charge with a primal roar of his own, a sound that echoed the ancient calls of his warrior ancestors. He moved with a speed Alara hadn't known he possessed, a blur of motion, swinging the log with devastating precision. The first man went down with a guttural cry, his weapon clattering to the floor. Alara, seizing an axe that had fallen from a villager's grasp, positioned herself behind Kyle, a silent, fierce protector. She had never truly fought, but instinct guided her, a primal understanding that this was a fight for everything. It was brutal, chaotic, a desperate struggle within the confines of the small cabin. Wood splintered, bodies collided, and the air filled with grunts of effort and the metallic tang of fear. Cale fought with a furious, economical grace, his blows precise and powerful, driven by the urgency of his prophetic burden. Alara, though less skilled, moved with surprising agility, deflecting blows, creating openings for Cale, her eyes scanning for weaknesses, for escapes. The villagers, initially confident in their numbers, began to falter. This was not the frightened demon they had expected, nor the submissive woman. This was a force, two beings united by an unyielding resolve. Taran, seeing his men falling, his plan unraveling, let out a frustrated bellow. "Burn it! Burn them both!" A man rushed forward with a flaming brand, aiming for the dry log walls. It was a desperate, ultimate choice, a terrifying gambit. Alara saw it, a flash of red and gold against the dim light, and knew with a terrible certainty that the cabin was lost. They would die here, consumed by the very flames meant to cleanse the land. Their fight, valiant as it was futile against the combined might of fear and fire. A decision, sharp and immediate, formed in her mind, a desperate final resort. It was not a choice of victory, but of defiant survival, a promise whispered to the dying world of Kyle's vision. The smoke began to fill the small space, acrid and choking, curling up from the igniting logs. Kyle, seeing the flames, seemed to understand. He met Alara's gaze, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded, her face grim but resolute. There was only one path left open to them. They had to leave this place, this conflict. They had to flee, not just from the village, but towards the desolate, uncertain future their intertwined destinies demanded. This was not the end. It was a harrowing, painful beginning. The air outside was colder, but the fire inside the cabin would soon consume everything, leaving only ashes and the chilling memory of their impossible struggle. Their lives, now irrevocably bound by a shared, terrifying secret, would find their future not in conquest, but in flight, a desperate race against a world determined to erase them. The roar of the flames consuming Alara's cabin filled the cold night, a furious, devouring sound that echoed across the desolate landscape. Smoke, thick and acrid, billowed into the sky, a dark column against the pale, anemic moonlight. The villagers, momentarily stunned by the sudden, decisive flight of Alara and Kyle, stared at the inferno, their faces illuminated by the dancing firelight. A mixture of triumph and unease etched upon them. They had driven out the demon and the witch, but at what cost? The destruction felt final, a tearing of the fabric of their familiar world. Alara and Kyle did not look back. They ran, their movements a desperate, synchronized rhythm through the snow, away from the heat, away from the shouts, away from the rigid boundaries of the village's fear. They were exiled, cast out, but alive, and for the first time in Ilara's life, not truly alone. Their immediate escape was fueled by adrenaline and the sheer will to survive. They ran until their lungs burned, until their muscles screamed in protest, deep into the familiar, yet now alien wilderness. The mountains, once a solace for Ilara, now seemed a vast, unforgiving expanse, their peaks reaching towards a sky that felt indifferent to their plight. Kyle, despite his recent weakness, moved with an astonishing resilience, his warrior instincts guiding them through hidden ravines and over treacherous icy slopes. There was no destination, only a desperate forward momentum. They were two fugitives, linked by a shared secret, a terrifying vision that now pulsed at the forefront of Ilara's mind, a constant reminder of the stakes. The world they knew was ending, and they, two unlikely outcasts, were somehow tied to its fragile hope for renewal. Days bled into weeks, marked only by the shifting light of the sun and the gnawing ache of hunger. They lived off the land, relying on Ilara's intimate knowledge of herbs and small game, and Kale's uncanny ability to track and hunt with primal efficiency. Communication remained sparse, often through gestures, through shared glances, through the quiet comfort of presence. Yet a new kind of dialogue began to emerge, one of silent understanding. Kale would sometimes touch a plant, look at Ilara, and she would understand that it was part of the ancient world, part of the lost knowledge of his people. He would point to a specific star, and she would know it was a marker, a guide from his past, now illuminating their uncertain future. The silence between them was not empty, but filled with the weight of unspoken truths, of shared burdens, of a growing, profound respect. They were learning to read each other, to anticipate, to trust, building a connection that transcended the barriers of language and time. The harshness of their journey, the constant threat of the elements, the gnawing uncertainty, forged their bond into something unbreakable. Ilara, who had always felt solitary, now understood what it meant to truly rely on another, to have her fate inextricably linked with a soul as burdened and resilient as her own. Kale, in turn, found a quiet strength in her unwavering determination, a steady presence that anchored him in this strange new world. The raw fear of the early days began to recede, replaced by a quiet defiance, a stubborn refusal to be broken. The memory of the village, of their prejudice and their violence, faded into a background hum of insignificance. Their world was now defined by the desolate beauty of the wilderness, by the shared warmth of their meager fires, and by the vast, terrifying prophecy that bound them. The resolution was not one of triumphant return or easy peace. There was no grand victory over the forces of nature, no sudden societal acceptance. Their lives were now a permanent exile, a constant journey, driven by the echoes of Kyle's vision. But in this shared journey, in this enduring struggle, there was a profound and unexpected hope. The symbol of the green sprout, tenacious and vibrant, emerging from the cracked earth in Kale's vision, became their silent mantra. They were that sprout, two fragile lives clinging to existence in the face of overwhelming odds, carrying within them a spark of resilience, a promise of renewal. Their bond was a testament to the unexpected connections that can form in the deepest despair, a quiet act of defiance against a world that sought to break them. The dark emotional tone of their initial struggle now gave way to a powerful, grounded hope. They were not just surviving, they were enduring together, facing an uncertain future with a quiet courage born of their intertwined destinies, a testament to the transformative power of compassion in a world consumed by ice and fear. They walked forward, two shadows against the vast, indifferent landscape, their story a stark, dramatic whisper of survival, of love born of trauma, and of the enduring, fragile hope found in the heart of a frozen world.